You wait. When the white robe shows up, we'll all be as dead men.
Open-world games are so prevalent these days and have been for so long that it's pretty easy to forget the time when 3D open worlds were relatively new, and the freedom, exploration, and immersion they offered still felt groundbreaking and fascinating for people like me who got easily drawn in by many of them. Games with expansive worlds or universes date back as far as the 80s, but it's late 90s and early 2000s titles like Shenmue, Grand Theft Auto 3, and Morrowind that are often credited with heralding in the genre's explosion in popularity that still exists today. But there is another game from back then with a grim, atmospheric world that sticks out in my mind as much, if not more, than any others from that period. For this, we have to go to Germany, where in 2001, the game development studio Piranha Bytes released their very first game, the open-world fantasy RPG, Gothic. One of many things that's always stood out to me about Gothic is Piranha Bytes' choice for its setting. While designing a game with a heavy focus on exploration and freedom, someone in the development room decided they were going to set the game in a prison. To be more precise, it's actually a prison colony and the valley surrounding it. And there are elements you'd expect from a typical fantasy setting, like a castle, mages, and plenty of monsters. But I've still always wondered if there isn't at least a hint of intentional humor in that decision, although I haven't found anything to confirm or deny this. One of Gothic's developers said during a 1998 interview that he wanted Gothic to have a smaller world than the vast, procedurally generated world in The Elder Scrolls Daggerfall, which had released 2 years prior. Like Piranha Bytes, Bethesda later ended up being of this same mind, which is why the size of Morrowind's world was significantly scaled down. Piranha Bytes used this idea to create a more focused, but still large, handcrafted world that allowed for more attention to detail, and thankfully, not as much fog. So the prison idea makes more sense when it's put into that context, but it still always felt a little ironic to me and lends to my perception of Piranha Bytes as a developer not afraid to think outside the box and do things a little differently, which I think is reflected in various aspects of their games. Like the world in Gothic's uncaring attitude towards your character, who doesn't even have a name and is just a lowly prisoner and definitely not some fancy hero. Sure, the game's satisfying progression system lets you eventually beat up anyone and anything with ease, but the most engaging parts in Gothic, and its, for the most part, bigger and better sequel, are those long opening chapters where you're compelled to explore, but still weak enough that a wrong turn can mean running into enemies far above your weight class. Gothic 1 and 2 aren't without flaws, but overall, I think they're both great games. They have a very distinct style and appeal, with their rich and murky atmospheres, rewarding progression systems, and gruff but endearing characters.
I'll join you for a while, if you don't mind. I'm sure you'll need a friend.
Well, most of them. Unfortunately, it's pretty difficult to find other games that offer a similar kind of experience. Gothic 3 made a lot of changes to the formula of the first two games, and released in a very buggy, unfinished state. Thankfully though, the first game in Piranha Bytes' next series embodies some of Gothic 1 and 2's most enjoyable qualities, and feels like refreshingly familiar territory, although with some major differences too. The action RPG Risen came to PC and Xbox 360 back in 2009. After the backlash from Gothic 3's buggy, unfinished launch, and the support of a new publisher, certainly that same kind of mistake wouldn't be repeated, right? Sort of. Risen was by all accounts a finished game when it launched without glaring signs of a rushed development on PC. But the 360 port that was done by a company called Wizardbox reportedly had a bunch of technical issues. However, last January, kinda out of nowhere, Risen got ported to modern consoles and got an update on PC. I haven't played any of the ports, but on PC after the update, I encountered some problems with the sound and mouse sensitivity. Switching to a public beta version on Steam adds a bunch of fixes, and things ran pretty smoothly afterwards, so I recommend doing that if you play the Steam version. Risen's opening cutscene starts off with a cryptic warning about how humanity released something mysterious and sinister onto the world by banishing gods that had enslaved them. This part was a little too brief and generic to really heighten my interest, but it does give an explanation for the game's title.
Something older than man has risen.
Next, it cuts to a ship sailing through a storm where you're introduced to the main character, Commander Shepard. It's actually another nameless character. He's a stowaway on board the ship, and that's all the information you ever get about his backstory. Now things get a little more interesting. You're shown a mysterious man with a strange ruby monocle, magic that reveals a hideous monster, and before you know it, you're shipwrecked and wash up on shore of the island where the entire game takes place. After scouring the beach for supplies, you find that there's only one other survivor, a woman named Sarah, who mentions that the man with the monocle was from the Inquisition. Initially, Sarah seems like she might be an important character, but she's only around for the first few minutes. You drop her off at a nearby abandoned house, and then you're off on your own to explore. Okay, so this is actually a pretty far breath away from the unique and engrossing premise that Gothic had. But you could say that about most games, even Gothic 2. It does feel a little lackluster, but at least it raises some questions to try and pull you in, and it's all over pretty quickly, so you don't have to wait long before actually getting to play. Risen is a very combat-centric game, and you start encountering enemies right away. You quickly learn that early on, everything can kill you really easily. Wolves will kill you, boars will kill you, goofy-looking birds will kill you, even Sarah will beat you up with her bare fists if you attack her. There's just not a lot of room for failure initially, and a scarcity of armor during the first chapter means that you can't just throw on new gear and make the beating stop. Even later on when you're leveled and are better equipped, some enemies still hit hard, and just a few missteps can have serious consequences. This forces you to avoid some enemies at first, and learn enemy attack patterns in order to exploit their weaknesses. Some will lunge forward to attack, which you can sidestep and counter. Others might freeze for a second after you block their attacks, or you can parry or backstep at just the right second to get an opening. If you're like me, then the reload button becomes your best friend for a while, but once you have a better idea of what to expect, get the timing down, and learn to deal with the somewhat finicky auto-targeting system, you can start unleashing 3-hit combos that end with a powerful blow which can put down a lot of enemies. The challenge becomes part of the fun once you start seeing the tides turn in your favor, and because a lot of enemies have heavy damage output, the stakes are usually high, which contributes to the gratification that comes along with victory. The controls feel responsive, and in true Piranha Bytes fashion, the progression system goes beyond just increasing the damage you do, and lets you learn new attacks as you raise a melee weapon's skill level, like a side sweep to help deal with groups of enemies, and most useful of all, power attacks that charge up and pump out major damage. There's a sense of duality to your progression here, where you feel like you're becoming better at the game from a player skill perspective, and your character is simultaneously becoming more adept at his weapon skill by learning these new attacks, which is really awesome. Unfortunately, this kind of interesting progression doesn't apply to ranged combat, where raising your skill just increases the speed of your attacks. Fighting with bows or crossbows has a considerably more straightforward approach. You basically just aim and shoot while moving away from enemies. This was way less engaging for me than the more strategic and brutal melee combat. Plus, sometimes I'd have to resort to close combat anyway when a charging enemy caught up to me. No matter what weapon you decide to use though, or how good you get at the mechanics, there's no doubt that you're meant to feel pretty worthless during the game's early stages. It's very similar to Gothic in this regard, and having played Gothic beforehand, I had no issue embracing this and pushing myself through the early struggles because I was confident that it would pay off down the road. I might have even let out a sadistic laugh after getting mauled by a boar for the dozenth time. Risen is a solid zero to hero experience where you get a real sense of accomplishment as you rise up from literally nothing at the beginning to become a death machine by the end. And maybe the game's title is referring to that too. I should mention though that I never felt incredibly overpowered like I did towards the end of Gothic. There are some glaring issues with repetitive enemies during Risen's final chapters, which I'll get into more later, but at the very least some of those segments were still decently challenging to deal with. Another cool carryover from Gothic is that you rely on trainers to increase your skills. When you level up, you gain learning points that are totally worthless unless you cash them in at a trainer. Seeking these trainers out makes you feel more connected with the game world and adds to the challenge a bit by also requiring you to pay gold. You might be on a secluded island, but there's no escape from capitalism. In some cases, you might even want to choose narrative paths that benefit certain skills you want to raise, like joining the bandit faction to have access to the best sword fighting trainer. And a nice little immersive detail is that sometimes these trainers actually explain what they're teaching you, so it's not just like they're magically uploading the knowledge into your brain.
I know Kung Fu.
The final part of the combat system to talk about is magic, which is split into two categories: crystal magic and runes/scrolls. Crystal magic consists of 3 ranged attack spells, and they're similar to ranged weapons in that you just aim and shoot to use them. There's the magic bullet spell, and wow, what a creative name for a ranged spell. It's actually appropriate though because it's significantly faster than the other two, and can work almost like an assault rifle. But the one I enjoyed the most was the frost spell because it works well as support for a melee build. Freezing a couple of enemies in a group to thin the herd and create one-on-one battles, or just freezing whoever you're facing before pummeling them, were both helpful strategies that I used a lot during the game's final 2 chapters. Runes and scrolls both grant you access to the same types of spells. You can only use runes if you join the Mages branch in one of the 2 joinable factions, and anyone can use scrolls. Most of the spells here aren't actually combat related, and are more for environmental puzzles like telekinesis and levitation. But there are a couple of combat spells too, and they're a bit more interesting than crystal magic, like summoning a skeleton named Fred to fight for you, or transforming into an ash beast and going on a King Kong rampage. From the very onset of Risen's first chapter, you're granted the freedom to travel, or try to travel, to almost anywhere you want to go on the island, with the exception of just a few late game areas blocked off by magic barriers. And you'll need to bribe your way into the island's main city, but that's not hard to do. After the storm that wrecked your ship subsides, the dawn of the next morning reveals a noticeable difference between Risen's setting and that of the early Gothic games. Those games mostly used a dark and grungy color scheme. I mean, it is called Gothic after all. And while Risen does have a few areas that use similar tones, it embraces its tropical setting with more warm colors. There's a day and night cycle, NPCs follow specific schedules, weather effects like storms return on occasion, and earthquakes coming from a volcano in the middle of the island rumble periodically. These all do a decent job at making the island feel like a living, breathing place, and overall I'd say that the island is a visually pleasing place to travel through. There are dense areas of fairy tale-like forestry, misty overgrown swamplands, velvety blue midnight skies, and baking sunlight during the day that can literally make you squint when you exit a cave. Sometimes you can almost forget that the game is 15 years old. Sometimes. Risen's soundtrack is done by the same composer for the Gothic series, and there are a lot of slow, tranquil melodies which are pretty subtle and fit in snugly right there with the ambience, sometimes evoking a slight sense of mystery. The music and visuals make wandering around the island pretty relaxing, until monsters start trying to murder you, which happens like every few seconds until you've cleared out some areas. As nice as it is to take in the atmosphere, the biggest thrill of exploration is hunting down the plethora of enemies that are out there. Combat experience generally outweighs quest experience, and once you get a taste of the rewarding progression system, the call to adventure becomes hard to ignore, and exceeds the caution of running into threats that you aren't properly prepared to deal with. Because those are totally out there. Monsters too strong for low-level characters gatekeep certain areas, and members of the Inquisition faction called Warriors of the Order lurk around waiting to kidnap you and enlist you in their services. If you want to decide which faction to join for yourself, then you have to be careful to avoid them. This real danger adds some tension to exploration, as you wonder if something truly sinister might be around the next corner, and it motivates you to become stronger so you can eventually take on everything that's out there. It can also make for some pretty epic moments where you manage to outmaneuver or overcome much stronger foes, like sneaking up on an Order encampment to rob some of the chests they're guarding, or discovering a ruin out in the wilderness that's guarded by skeletons who are way too strong for you, but then stubbornly insisting on fighting them anyway, barely surviving, and getting rewarded with an ugly looking helmet that's actually pretty valuable because it's the only helmet you can find during the first chapter. I often felt like I was on a one-man mission to conquer the island, vanquishing obstacles in my path while steadily growing stronger and acquiring items and gear that I knew would help open up even more areas since I'd soon be able to defeat the threats that guard them. Purchasing tools and investing in utility skills like lockpicking, prospecting, gut animals, and smithing gives more ways to interact with the environment and makes discoveries even more fruitful by letting you find, sell, and create more useful gear and items. Alchemy might be the most useful skill in the entire game, because you can use plants you find to brew potions that give permanent stat bonuses, which can raise certain skills way beyond what you can get from trainers. Exploring the island and gradually growing stronger is addicting and highly enjoyable, and you'd be doing yourself a huge disservice if you don't spend a chunk of the first 2 chapters ignoring important quests for a while so you can search around as much as possible. There is a downside to all of this though, and that is that there's hardly any meaningful story content out there in the wilderness. The overwhelming majority of Risen's quests take place within the island's 3 main settlements. Running into NPCs outside of those places is pretty rare, and instances of environmental storytelling are even less common. Adding more opportunities to stumble on side quests, interesting NPCs, and maybe some lore about the island could have added another dimension to exploration and made it even more engaging. However, the game was probably better off without this because I wasn't a big fan of a lot of the writing. I'll start by saying that other than Fred, the silent skeleton you can summon to fight for you, there really weren't any characters that I found to be memorable or even all that likable. In Gothic, despite the rough attitudes that a lot of characters have, you ended up feeling kinda like you were part of a brotherhood, even after beating all of them up. Being trapped in the colony is a crappy situation that you all experience together, which forms a kind of bond between you, and when I ran into some of these guys again in Gothic 2, I felt genuinely glad to see them.
Brothers don't shake hands. Brothers gotta hug.
At the very beginning of Gothic, a guy named Diego lends you a hand and becomes a reoccurring character throughout the game. He gives you useful advice, helps you join the old camp if that's what you want to do, serves as a valuable trainer for important skills, and teams up with you for a while later in the game. So when I encountered him again in Gothic 2, of course I was going to do the quest that helps him find his lost gold. But I felt no such connection with anyone in Risen, and there are definitely some wasted opportunities where the game could have reused NPCs more to help your character form some meaningful relationships. Like Sarah from the very beginning. The opening cutscene shows that you were stowaways on the ship together before becoming the only survivors of a shipwreck. But then she's out of the game for good, and just becomes a professional broom sweeper on this guy's porch with no other impact on the story. The very next character you meet after Sarah is Jan, a bandit hunter who's serving as a lookout not too far from where you washed ashore. He helps you find a better weapon, fills you in on some information about the island, and then escorts you to a couple of important areas nearby. But after this, he's gone from the story too. Rachel is an important character in the bandit camp, one of the island's 3 major settlements. If you decide to do most of the quests here, you can help her out of a really tough spot by restoring order to the camp. But then, when you try to talk to her again later, she just gets pissed at you and tells you to go away.
Don't just stand around. Be off with you.
Really the only NPC that the writers made any kind of attempt to get you attached to is a character named Patty, and it's not a very good attempt. You randomly meet her working at a bar in the island's main city, and she eventually becomes an important character who's involved with the main quest line. In the context of the story, some of the quests she's part of are mutually beneficial, but they're mainly aimed at doing favors for her, like helping her escape the city and rescuing her when she gets kidnapped.
If someone's going to walk into the arms of the Inquisition, I'd rather it was you. No offense.
There's some effort to give her a sympathetic backstory by making her father a notorious pirate, and she displays a small amount of wit on occasion, but overall I thought her character was pretty flat and uninteresting, with the writers seeming content to rely on other aspects to try and make her likable. Her voice acting is a plus though. Lena Headey voices her and a few other characters, and Gimli and Gollum voice the leaders of the game's 2 joinable factions. I wouldn't say that these or most of Risen's other characters are exactly bursting with personality, including the main character, and they're way more toned down than the eccentric and campy personalities that Gothic had, but I still think that a lot of the performances here were done well.
I heard he was here. That's why I came. But I got stranded by the storms. Then the owner of this place was killed. Got sent into the ruins by the Inquisition. So I took this place over. Haven't found a trace of my father, though. He must be somewhere outside the town.
Well, I suppose we're all castaways on this island. Cast away by life, now cast away by those storms. I'll give you a chance, castaway. Prove your luck to me.
And there is no sign of magic, which is why there is no reason for me to give personal attention to this case. I have more important things to consider. But I must know if this was a petty crime or something more. Come to me when you have answers.
Risen's main plot focuses on ruins across the island that have recently risen up out of the ground and released monsters, and the mystery of what role these might play in storms and giant creatures known as titans that have been ravaging the world, like those that wrecked your ship at the beginning of the game. A group called the Inquisition has arrived and taken over parts of the island to investigate, and through your eventual interactions with them, you end up aiding in this investigation. Developments in the story are very spaced out at first because you spend so much time during the first half of the game exploring and focusing on smaller subplots, but the pacing picks up pretty drastically during chapters 3 and 4, the game's final 2 chapters. By the time you reach this point though, the main plot feels almost like an afterthought to everything else you've been doing, and there's really nothing that I thought was intriguing or captivating enough to hook me back in. There are some important reveals and key moments that alter the course of events during the second half of the game, but to me they felt pretty unsatisfying and in some cases very predictable, especially the so-called twist that happens at the end. What Risen does mostly get right in regards to its story, and what the Gothic games did well too, are your initial interactions with the factions inhabiting the island. There are 2 joinable factions, and by the end of Chapter 1 you have to choose between them. Unless the Inquisition has their way and captures you, but then you can just... The faction structure almost completely mirrors that of Gothic 2's. You have a well-organized outside force, the Inquisition, holding control of the island's main city, and a group of rebel bandits camping in the swamps who oppose them. There's also a mages branch of the Inquisition that you can join too. The members and leaders of these factions inhabit the island's 3 major settlements, which are pretty densely packed with NPCs, many of whom offer side quests or at least some form of interaction through dialogue, training, or trading. There's the bandit camp in the swamps, a monastery called Volcano Keep, and a harbor town called Harbor Town. The bandit camp is a great first stop because, unlike the other 2 settlements, you're never locked inside. You can alternate between doing quests and intermittently exploring the island, returning whenever you want to make use of the many trainers who reside here. The quests in this area primarily focus on solving trivial issues that have caused the camp to become dysfunctional during the absence of its leader, Don Esteban, who's holed up inside of a ruin at the back of the camp, and your attempt to get inside this ruin and speak with him. While most of the quests here are rather simple and don't usually involve any daring adventures, they are believable for the kinds of issues that would plague a rebel outpost like this. Things like dealing with a camp bully, convincing workers who are spooked or slacking off to get back to work, hunting nearby creatures, and bribing a drunk with beer for information.
I'd rather sit here and have a little drinky-dinky-doo.
Each major settlement has its own distinct mood and theme, and they're great places to enjoy the game's strong atmosphere for a while and take a breather from your many fights with monsters. Volcano Keep is the Inquisition's main area of operations on the island, and if you join them, you have to go through basic training here. I found this to be a very immersive segment of the game because it really feels like you're going through an actual initiation to get accepted into their order. They give you room and board, dress you in a robe, you interact with other recruits, and take tests given to you by the Order's masters. It's almost like being Harry Potter at wizard school, but there's also a fair bit of sparring and some side quests too, including one of the better ones in the game, a multi-part quest where you investigate the murder of another recruit. Harbor Town is the largest and most crowded of the 3 settlements, and it's the only place that can be considered an actual town or city on the island. As you'd expect from such, it also has the most diverse population, with lots of neutral NPCs, some notable side characters, and members of both the Don's bandit crew and the Inquisition. Its lively, bustling nature, along with its distinct districts, variety of shops, and peaceful view of the harbor at its center, make it a charming and eventful place to travel through initially. There's a lot of content here in the way of quests, and if you try to do them all, you can definitely be here for a while. Unless you get captured beforehand, Harbor Town is also where you choose your faction. Many of the quests here have two possible outcomes, one which aids the bandits, and one which aids the Inquisition. Help one faction enough times, and that's who you'll join. It's nice to have some agency here to affect the local conflicts between them, and your eventual decision of who to join does impact some of the more immediate aspects of the story. However, this impact does eventually dwindle, and the story becomes very linear regardless of who you choose. Really, the most significant outcome of your decision is how it affects your build, since some of the top trainers for various melee skills are only accessible to members of a certain faction. Also, the only way to gain access to crystal magic is by joining the Inquisition, and it also affects what armor you wear. Not having a greater impact on the story is a letdown, because so much time and focus gets invested on the faction subplots early on that you'd expect it to play a larger narrative role down the road. Although this won't really come as a surprise if you've played other Piranha Bytes games before, because it's pretty much exactly like this in Gothic too. Risen's first two chapters take up the bulk of the game. I'd say about 2/3 of your playtime if you do at least a significant portion of the side quests and explore the island extensively. But the final two chapters almost feel longer because they unfortunately have some pretty mind-numbing sections that can be a chore to get through. Once you hit Chapter 3, Risen does a hard pivot away from the free-roaming style of gameplay you mostly experienced up until then, and tightens its focus on the main story while turning almost completely into a dungeon crawler. This sounds like a drastic change, and it is, but I'm not totally against the idea of a major shift like this. Taking all of the experience and growth that you earned while exploring, and using it to delve into challenging dungeons that really test your mettle at the end, could have been the icing on the cake for the game's progression system. But the heavy reliance on repetitive mobs and simplistic puzzles made these areas feel more tedious than enjoyable. For as long as I can remember, I've never had a problem with lizards. They're interesting, adaptable, and some of the most unique looking creatures on the planet. But my opinion of this entire animal group might be permanently damaged after playing Risen. From Chapter 3 onwards, Saurians, or lizardmen, make up a big majority of the enemies you face. Certain variants of them can be a challenge to deal with, even for high-level characters, thanks to their fast and powerful attacks, and the fact that sometimes you encounter large groups of them. Taking on these groups with just a melee weapon requires some pretty excellent timing to avoid their attacks, and the Frost spell really saved me some frustration here by making a lot of these fights noticeably easier. Fights like these were somewhat satisfying at first, but then you have to face them over and over and over for essentially the rest of the game, and the sheer repetition got very annoying after a while. They aren't the only enemies you face during these chapters, but they're definitely the most prevalent. And sometimes I breathed a sigh of relief whenever I encountered something different. There's also a sharp increase in the amount of traps and puzzles you run into. To get past most of these, you do simple tasks like pull levers, find small statues to open doors, and use necessary spells. You seldom had to use a lot of these spells earlier in the game, so it is kind of nice to have a place to put them to use. And some of them are pretty cool, like the Nautilus spell, which lets you morph into a little snail and squeeze through small enclosures. But the puzzles were usually easy enough that it felt more like I was just going through the motions instead of engaging in any kind of critical thinking. As much as I truly enjoyed the exploration, progression, atmosphere, and faction subplots during the first two chapters, after hours of mostly just lizard bashing and dealing with shallow puzzles, I was ready for the game to be over. Which takes us to the final boss fight. To make it here, you've survived a shipwreck, carefully avoided capture by forces of the Inquisition, fought merciless creatures, and worked your way up from a worthless nobody to a powerful warrior, meticulously scoured every corner of the island for potent ingredients and reliable gear, ingratiated yourself with the island's factions, studied in the ways of magic, saved a damsel in distress, delved deep into fiery dungeons hacking away at terrible beasts, and all of these trials and tribulations culminate in doing some simple platforming and being forced to use a weapon that you might not have even trained for. It's an incredibly disappointing fight, to say the least, and just weird that they would basically dump the entire combat system at the end when it's relied upon so heavily throughout the game. The boss doesn't dish out much damage, so unless you fall, you probably won't have much trouble, and it's all over pretty quickly. If you stick around past the credits, you get a short little conversation between your character and Patty, and then that's it. Even though Risen's final 2 chapters leave a lot to be desired, what it gets right during chapters 1 and 2, it gets really right. And despite the significant drop-off, I still think it's an enjoyable game overall. To me, it's not as memorable or endearing as the first 2 Gothic games were, but it does have better combat than those games, and it still reminds me of them more than any other game has. Risen did go on to get 2 less well-received sequels, but the more recent news regarding Piranha Bytes is that they unfortunately got shut down earlier this year. It's undoubtedly sad news for dedicated fans that have enjoyed some of their games and appreciate all the hard work they've put in over the years. Some light in the darkness here is that there are at least a couple of games out there that are influenced by Piranha Bytes that I'm still excited to try, like Drova Forsaken Kin, and there's even a Gothic 1 remake on the horizon, so that's hopefully something to look forward to.